Yo, what's good? It's your girl, Becky the Poet here. Welcome to the Unspoken Words podcast. We are here with the Vin Collective at the Blind Bishop here for Wine and Rhyme. Next to we have Nancy Wallace. So this podcast episode will be a little bit different. We're actually live here at the Blind Bishop. All right. We have our fellow audience here listening. Yeah. We also have Richard and Nancy here. They are the founder. If you guys are watching this, they're the founder of the Vin Collective. And you'll hear a little bit more about who Nancy Wallace is later on. So before we get started, we're going to do this podcast episode a little bit different. So the way this is going to be run is you're going to get a little bit more insight of me, Becky the Poet, a.k.a. Becky LaVarn, but in the streets you can call me Becky the Poet. So we have Nancy Wallace who'll be giving me all these questions, and some fellow audience will be asking some as well too. So we'll go ahead and get started. So what's my first question, Nancy? Actually, first, give a little intro about who you are and what you do.
Hello. My name is Nancy Wallace. I'm with the Vin Collective.
Go ahead and bring it closer.
And this is our series called Bottles, Bites, and Binge Worthy. And in this series, we feature local artists, local performers, people that contribute to the culture in our community. And we want to highlight and spotlight them and pair it with wine, because everything goes with wine. You just need to know how to pair it well. So in today's journey, I wanted to speak with Becky to get to know more about Becky the Poet, things that we didn't know, and ways that you can get started on your own journey for journaling, poetry, just a greater level of expression, which is also a greater level of self-care. So Becky,
okay,
how long have you been a poet, and what started you on your journey?
So poetry, I would say, started out in middle school. I was in 6th grade. And it always starts in English class, of course. My teacher at the time was Mrs. Anderson. Very common name, so you can't go find her. But I'm actually from Oklahoma City. And poetry at that time was, I guess, something that I didn't know of quite yet. I got exposed to music before I did poetry. Okay. And then while in my English class, we had to sit down and journal. She'll give us a topic, you write about it, and she gave us opportunity to read it out loud in front of the class. Okay. So one poem I wrote about my mother, and I've learned this every time. Every time I write a poem about my mom, I can never get through it because I'm always in tears. And so that's how I knew, I was like, well, I have some expressions going on. I have emotions going on, and I'm expressing it right now, you know? And so I got really fond with the type of poem of free verse, free writing. So there's no rhyme, there's no rhythm. It's kind of just words that you can put together and it be a poem. Further deeper into poetry, I've learned how to, I guess, maneuver how to make it to sound very more poetic and add the music behind it.
Okay, so the rhythm with the rhyme, all in a measure. So your inspiration for poetry, where did that come from?
So my inspiration for poetry kind of came from so my podcast is called Unspoken Words. It just came from not being able to speak my emotions out loud, especially to my parents, right? I came from old school parents who you got food on your plate, you have a roof over your head, you got through school, that's all you need. You should be happy, right? But I think in life, my parents didn't understand emotions of how we felt, the reasons why we would cry, the reasons why we were in pain as in we just fell, and I think sometimes when you hurt yourself after your parents told you not to do something, it's kind of my parents saw it as a punishment to well, that's what I told you so type of deal, right? But it was well, at that moment in time, I didn't want you to say that. I wanted you to be more expressive to me and a little bit nurturing. Mm-hmm. So my inspiration came from me not being able to speak up for myself and talking to other people and having them having the same issue. So I was well, why not share this with the world, right? Because I feel the stuff that I write about is not just about the politics, it's about the personal things and the mental health that we go through on a daily basis.
Yes. So you know that the expressions of emotion vary between generations. So when you talk about your parents' generations and you start looking back in further generations, as you're providing your level of exposure of your emotional awareness, How do you find that different from what you've read growing up versus what you're writing now?
So I feel like I once read one of my poems at my cousin's funeral, right? My aunt relayed that to my mom, and my mom goes, whatever you're saying up there, you need to slow it down, right? So, like, my mom understood what I was reciting up there was just words of just how I felt, right? But I felt like coming from her, there's no, in my culture, my family doesn't know what poetry is. It's either music or rap, right? They'll like, they put that into two different categories, okay? So, like, these emotions that my mom, like, hear me express and say, she just thinks it's just, like, nonsense and me being, like, unreasonable with what's going on right now. Compared to what I write now is, like, the actual truth to, like, how I feel, right? But nowadays, you kind of have to sugarcoat poetry because if you're so blank about it, I feel like people take it the wrong way.
And, you know, what is so very interesting is those that know you from your history of origin tend to be the ones that receive you the least.
Right.
When you have a gift like that. How have you been able to push past that just to continue your expression?
I think if I go to open mic and when you're on stage, I always feel like this. I feel like I can't hear anybody up there. So I don't know if anybody's clapping for me. I don't know if anybody's screaming for me. I can't hear because, one, I'm very nervous. And two, I just can't hear at that moment in time. But if I'm able to step off that stage and somebody can tell me, like, hey, I, like, understand where you're coming from, or I feel that, it just makes me feel so much better about myself because, like, I feel like even people who are older than me, as in I'm 28 now, so anybody over 28, older than me, to be able to relate to my poems, it speaks wonders to me because I feel like they have kids that maybe their kids at that age it's difficult for them to express themselves. Mm-hmm. So it puts them in a different perspective to, okay, maybe my kid is like their age, maybe they're going through the same thing and they're showing the same signs, you know? So I just feel like that's how, like, I can reach people of all different endeavors.
So let's shift the conversation a bit. Let's say I'm a poet and I just don't know it.
Okay.
Where do I need to start if I want to get started on the journey?
So poetry is like rap, right? That's how I see it. I grew up listening to Wale and J. Cole, right? So their instrumentals are very subtle. So luckily we have YouTube University where a lot of people are posting their instrumentals on there. So when I talk about free write, I talk about how you can just write a whole bunch of words on a piece of paper, right? Mm-hmm. It takes, like, multiple edits for you to, like, create an actual great piece. I'll tell you that. So literally, like, the tempo of the instrument allows me to pause and make it more serious. When the tempo increases, I can speed up and get through what I need to get through and then slow it back down. So I feel like, in general, how people can start writing is just write a whole bunch of words. Read it after the first 2-3 times and be like, all right, that doesn't make sense. That's too much information. Let's take some words out. And then see how it goes with some, like, a nice, subtle piano, peaceful music and see if it flows from, like, beat by beat to just write and just kind of rap, but not rap. Like, speak about it in a subtle way. I don't know if people ever listen to poets. They have, like, a specific tempo when they're performing. They follow, like, a specific cadence in their voice, if you really pay attention. And it's just kind of like having I don't know what you call that thing, the thing that goes like a metronome, yes. Right? So it's like having a metronome in the background to where it's like they're actually going from word to word with the metronome. So I'd say free verse is the best way to go. And then continue to edit it because your first piece is never your final draft. And then speak about it out loud. Because when you hear it out loud, you can say, like, wait, that doesn't sound right. Or there needs to be a comma here and a period here. And so that's what I would say, like, that's how I would feel like the start of like writing poetry should start.
So your inspiration for writing something new, it just comes from your everyday life, the change in the seasons, the change of relationships, the change that's happening around you. Where does that daily inspiration come from?
So my inspiration comes from like conversations. So I've learned by talking in terms of like conversations help me remember things about people and things that we talk about. And that's where I take my lessons in life, from like conversations with people. And I've learned that in life that like if you listen, you'll like hear a lot more than what people are actually saying. So I've literally had to listen to people to be inspired with my poetry. So sometimes my poems aren't even about me. They're about another person's situation. But I put myself in their place to speak about their story out loud. Now, and that's why I feel like it's a universal type of thing for me, because I feel like people never know if it's really about me or about somebody else unless they really, really ask.
And that's almost a way of self-editing so that you're not really offending someone directly if they're not quite understanding what personhood you're speaking from.
Right.
It's interesting. So what about just listening in general? The listening skills are so important. So even in a basic conversation, the listening to what people are saying and then reading between what they're not saying, does that give you a lot of inspiration as well?
It does. I've learned that body language says a lot. And I'll tell you this, I'm not going to throw it out there, but I am going to throw it out there now. Like being a Sagittarius, you're a very observant person. So when you walk into a room, you kind of analyze it first, head on, right? And sometimes we're stuck in this whole entrepreneur, like I'm a business owner, I am this, and you want to state who you are and what you do. But sometimes going on about in daily life, you can develop imposter syndrome, or you just aren't feeling yourself that day. So sometimes you have to step back after people introduce themselves and really analyze, like, hey, are you having a good day today? Are you okay? Because from the way that you're standing or how you're talking to me right now, it really doesn't correlate to what you're saying to me.
Yes, incremental actions, that 1% that you notice in a shift and a change, it makes a whole difference in what's going on in the atmosphere. And, sometimes as you're working with people, you can tell when you walk into the room how the atmosphere shifts, how it changes. How do you adjust to that when you're getting ready to go on stage and you want to perform, and then something just shifts, like either darkness or a heaviness or just a big shift in the atmosphere happens?
I think that's one thing about being a performer. It's really hard, especially a poet. I am like a sponge, so I absorb people's energy. So if I see someone else cry, I'm going to cry. That's just how I am. I can't help doing that. When you walk into a room full of people, you kind of have to channel into your own tunnel vision and kind of just think that it's only you really in that room. So the whole metaphor of imagining people in their underwear is kind of true. You kind of imagine no one's really there out there because you're telling your story. But a lot of times you kind of have to read the room to give what people want, right? Like if I'm at an erotic poetry night, I'm not going to be reading sad poems.
Okay. So tell me about, there was one poem that I saw on Instagram.
Okay.
And you were talking about when you drop your new stuff, how you drop it. And one of the lines that you said was, I talked to my therapist about you.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're going through and developing poems like that, even journaling about what you talk to a therapist, a counselor, a professional about, that can be helpful for you. But when you're doing a poem like that, it seems like it's so very intimate and so very personal. Can you tell us about that experience for developing that?
So I started therapy like at a young age as well too. Same time when I started writing poetry. So I would say poetry is my therapy. But then like when you're going to these therapy sessions, you realize like you're not always seeing them due to like maybe you're in good in life, and so you're like, all right, I'll go like every 2 weeks, right? So before, when my therapy session started getting longer intervals in between, I had to journal and write down a list of things that was going on in my life. Because when you get to a therapy session, what's going to happen? You're just going to waste a whole hour of like, I don't remember what happened. I should have wrote this down, you know? So with my therapist, it's like having a relationship. I went through multiple therapists to find the right one due to the fact of like, I'm opening myself up to this person and I want answers in this particular way and I need to process what I'm going through, right? So it's like I had to like break up and make up and break up and find someone else when it comes to a therapist. So when I'm talking to her, and like typically all therapists know like I do poetry, so they're always recommending journaling more. And so when I'm talking to my therapist, we're literally being personal and like I'm laying out all my cards for her to just know that like this is what's going through my life. So when I put these conversations in my poems, I'm giving only pieces of the deck, not the whole deck. And the reason why I do that, it's like if I give all of me in this poem and give it to the audience, I'm left with nothing left. And that's what it feels like, metaphorically. And that's how my therapist, she's just like, well, you can only give part of the story because at the end of the day, people will write their own ending.
Yes, that's very interesting because you are the main character in your story, but you're not the main character in everyone's story.
Exactly.
Everyone is looking for their own part of being a main character. And I'd like to mention that we are at the Blind Bishop and the Master Psalm, Master of Wine, has started pouring. And Dilek, I'd like for you to start describing the wines that you're pouring now.
Yes, of course. So this is Lucera Brecht. It is a Cremant d'Alsace. It is made from 100% Pinot Noir. And this is a rosé, Alsace Pinot Noir. Alsace rosé has to be only Pinot Noir. And this is a dry sparkling, and it is with sort of really fresh summer berries, and also with some sort of yeast, the lees influence, such as bread, dough, toast kind of aromas. So, yeah.
Wonderful. And that one is very delicious because that was one that was sampled back in early May.
Yeah. That's exactly.
Because I bought a few bottles of that one,
yes.
so I remember.
Yeah.
Okay. So going back to me being the poet that didn't know it.
All right.
And I'm getting started with my inspiration. And I'm starting my journaling process.
Okay.
I guess some of the basics of what I would have to do is start with my awareness of my environment.
Right.
What other tips could you give me?
So I imagine like this. I never drink when I write poetry due to the fact that when you drink, you kind of end up veering off to a whole different energy.
I don't believe that. I'm not a firm believer in that. I believe that wine pairs well with everything. But please, continue.
So I don't drink when I write poetry, but I do go back to a memory.
Okay.
So we're going to go ahead and be real personal here. So recently, one of my parents went out the country, right? Now, I called them on a special holiday just to say them hello and stuff to find out that they were out the country. So they didn't notify me that they were gone, okay? Now, it brings me PTSDs because this is why I started writing poetry. I came home one day from school to find that one of my parents had got married, and I have another new parent and 2 new siblings, and I was just like, okay. So this year, when I called this parent to talk to them, I was like, again? Like, are you going to get married again? That's what the first thing that came to my mind. So as I wrote a couple of pieces in rough draft currently right now, I sat there and literally had to analyze my emotions. Now, was I angry? Was I sad? Or was I just confused? So I laid out my words, and a lot of words were just hateful words at first, I'll tell you that. But over time, reading it over and over again, I started to realize that I wasn't really angry. I was just more sad than anything due to the lack of communication. So I had to really just sit there and be like, okay, this poem is going to be really, really sad. And so you kind of have to feel your emotions for that moment in time and kind of understand that where are you at? Are you happy? Are you confused? And then that kind of will portray how the end of the poem will go. And typically with my poems at the end, I always like to come out with something bright, something cheery, like a lesson I learned from it, due to the fact that anybody who's listening in the audience is always looking for the better outcome. Because if you leave them without the outcome, I feel like they're just cliffhangers, right? And people sometimes go looking for lessons to figure out how to solve their own problems, whether it's through other people's issues as well, too.
It's interesting that you mentioned leaving things with the bright and cheery ending, because in some genres that you always have to have the HAE, has to have a happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
So in that happy ending, I know that anger is a byproduct of deeper emotions.
Right.
So anytime there's anger, there's something else that's going on that's causing you to feel angry. Like David Banner, it wasn't just one thing that made him turn into the Hulk. It
Right.
was a series of different things that made him, get to that certain point. When you're thinking about taking something that's so personal and then putting that happy ending spin on it,
Mm-hmm.
how does that happen? Because sometimes, happy ending is the fairy tale itself. So how does that work out?
I think you think about it like this. You wake up every morning because you have to wake up, right? You have to keep living. But then there are some people who choose the other path some days, right? And those are like the heartbreaking paths. So like in our reality, if my story ended bad, I'm pretty sure, and be honest with anybody in this room and who's listening, you probably wouldn't see me here today. So if I had a bad ending, that's it. So it's like, on the most part, having a good ending allows me to know that I've learned something and I've grown from it, and that if I was to be able to deal with it again, that I know how to handle it. Because I believe that we are given lessons in life that we have to go through and just feel and just kind of struggle a little bit to know that there's always a good outcome. And I feel like if there wasn't a good outcome, like you wouldn't see the people who are here today. Because I think after that, we just given up.
And not giving up is a big part of the challenge. I think that is not giving up is a good reason to start journaling.
Yeah.
To push out emotion. But turning that journaling into poetry, into spoken word, that takes it to a whole different level. Do you ever find yourself like self-editing just to make sure? Because that is it's so intimate and it's so personal. And when I started the process of journaling, it was difficult because I didn't want to revisit negativity. But then at the same time, I liked being able to chart and being able to see the progress. And so I think being able to go back over time, especially like when we do our family planning, one of the things we do every year is we say, okay, what are we going to do for our family to take our family to the next level? And we journal that out. Sometimes, it's seeing it, saying it, writing it down, it seals it in the atmosphere and it makes it real. And you would subconsciously pursue those things, even though you may have forgotten about some things. But when I look back over that history, it's like, oh, you know what? We did do this, and we did do this, and we did do this. So we accomplished over half the list, and half the year is gone, so we still have time. So that whole process of journaling, I think is very important. Am I a daily journaler? No. That's real. Do you journal daily?
I do not journal daily.
But it's something that when I do it and I look back over time, I'm very encouraged by the change, the difference, the progress, especially when it comes to my family. So, any other tips that you'd like to share with everyone?
I would say this. So, number one, feel your emotions and know where you're at in life to write this poem and what direction you want to take it, right? Number two, if you're going to plan on reading out loud or sharing with the world, what message are you trying to give them? Because that's one thing about writing a poem for yourself and writing for an audience, right? And then 3, I just say write, read it out loud. All right, the mics are working.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Cameron, and I'm so happy to be here, first of all. But my question for you is, out of all the poems that you've written, which is either your favorite or like most memorable, like the one that really grips your soul? You know what I mean?
So this poem I wrote, it's weird because I don't ever put titles on my poems. Maybe I should. And you'll hear it today. I write about like finding my voice in poetry and how like although like I have these emotions, I'm still searching for what I'm really trying to say in my poems. And I'm like in my poem, I'm like literally, you can tell like my thoughts are like literally all over the place, and I'm still searching and searching. But then like I kind of realize where I'm at the end. And these are one of those poems where I actually leave a cliffhanger just due to the fact that I feel like at that moment in time when I wrote it, I have yet to have found that voice.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that.
No, you're welcome. And you'll actually hear it today, so I'll be performing in a little bit.
I love that. Perfect. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? What's your name? So my name is Becky. I go by Becky the Poet. I used to walk in the streets and say Becky with the good hair, but I just figured I'd just go with Becky the Poet.
Okay, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's see if anybody else has questions.
So my question for you is, when writing a poem, have you ever had one where it was like it took you a while to write it because the emotions were so strong?
I'm trying to like go through my filing cabinets in my brain. So it didn't take me a while to write it. It just took me a while to build the confidence to read it. So I love my mom to death. Any poem about my mom takes a lot out of me to read out loud. I don't even think I can get through the poem without even crying. And that's just literally, like, if you see me, I'm a crier. I can't help it. When I get my emotions get worked up to the surface of where I'm at, I just can't help but cry. But any poem literally about my mom takes a while to write because I feel like my mom is this perfect person in my life. So each poem that I write about her has to be perfect. It has to, like, sound right. It has to be an image of her verbally. So that's just any poem on my mom, which I'm not going to read tonight. My sign? That's so funny. I was just speaking about this earlier. I am a true Sagittarius. So, yeah. Any questions for me?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I don't really do astrology.
Okay.
I am a Leo by birth, late July, child of the sun.
Okay.
So when you're writing your poetry, do you find the similarities with the astrological signs to be as true to form when you're developing your poetry?
Yes. I will say Sagittarius, if whoever is into this astrology stuff knows that we are complete a-holes, okay? So we literally, yeah, we're very funny. But we're very, 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 very sensitive about how we can't take it back. We can dish it out, we can't give it back. So, like, my poems are just like that. You can kind of, like, now that people know, they'll listen and they'll be like, yep, that's the way. Because, like, if you go on Instagram, they always have those astrology, like, this is what a Sagittarius is, this is what a Virgo, Libra, all this stuff. It relates to that. Like, yeah.
When you said you were a crier,
Yeah.
I thought you were Pisces. I'll cry easily.
It takes a lot out of me, though, to cry. So.
You have a question?
So, how did you get over your stage fright for the first time you went up and did one of your poets?
I've learned to be blunt and straightforward, which is another sign of a Sagittarius. But I've learned to be open with the audience and tell them, hey, I'm nervous. I've actually learned I've learned this about poets. You have performing poets. You have poets who just write all day, who don't perform. And I'm one of those poets who can semi-do both. But on days that I'm really nervous, if there's like 100 people in the crowd, I am open to say, hey, I forgot my line. I'm going to pull out my phone and read off my phone. Okay. So I've learned to just be honest about how I'm feeling at that moment in time, because I feel like when you're honest, people reciprocate that a lot better, rather than being like, all right, you guys, like, I'm just going to make it up, because people can tell if you're making it up, you know?
So what advice do you give to new poets to kind of get over theirs? I mean, that's how you got over yours. Do you give them that same advice, or do you have other advice?
For new poets, I'd actually say be honest with yourself and be honest with the audience, but constantly practice. If your first open mic does not do well the first time, go to it again and come back harder, because you know what you are scared of, and you know how to, like, all right, I got to spend another week just memorizing my poems, repeating it out loud. Constant repetition is literally the only way to get through, like, a performance. And, like, honestly, every crowd that I've been to that's at open mic, everybody is, like, willing to be there in open arms, right? They're hyping you up. They're giving you lots of claps and snaps. And if you come back next time, if you read the same poem again, who cares? Because you probably have 10 new people in the crowd, you know? So I've read some of my poems continuously about like 50 times at probably the same open mic, due to the fact just because, one, the first 10 times weren't great, and then the next 5 times were probably great, but then the next 10 times I disappeared and I have a new crowd, right?
So that actually led to my question, which is the pressure for new material. Like a comedian, every time a comedian gets up there, they gotta have something new, because I don't want to hear that same joke that I just heard the last 2 times that I saw. So, is there that pressure for new material?
Is there pressure for new material in the poetry world? Definitely, yes. Poetry has become, now you have people who are paid poet. That's all they do all day. They go to college tours, they get paid to speak. And so new stuff is always a thing. It's kind of like we're waiting for Frank Ocean to drop his album, right? We know that when he does, it's going to be great. But now that he hasn't, all we do is replay the same old songs, right? And honestly, sometimes nowadays with music, you can remix it and then like do it differently, an uncovered, like an unedited version or whatever, right? So with poets and performing new stuff, it is a lot of pressure. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really cares about if it's old or new. I think they care about how it's being delivered. Because the first time it may have been delivered, it may not have been the greatest performance. So people probably don't even remember what's going on, right? But then when you deliver it, you practice it, and you're repeating the same thing, you're coming back with full-on, like, different energy, people remember that. And people want that. In the audience, people want that same poem. I have a friend, her name is Erica Lynette. She doesn't do poetry anymore. She kind of disappeared off the map. But she does this 90s poem where she relates, like, being in a relationship is, like, all these things that we remember in the 90s, right? And I will always forever, whenever I have her at my event, I will always request for her to like, perform that poem. Because it's, like, the best poem that I've heard. And I want to hear it over and over again. I know it probably line from line. And I still want to hear it because it's that good of a poem. Yes. So I'm actually going to perform for you guys. I'm going to stand up for this because it works better that way. But did anybody have any questions or anything? If not, oh yeah, I forgot to go ahead and be a millennial here. My Instagram is Becky the Poet. It's BCKY, the Poet, THE, and then Poet, POET. That's my Instagram. I'm very active on there. A little bit crazy on there, so don't mind me. I am I call myself the walking plug. I'm like all over Dallas, DFW Metroplex. So if you have anything, if you need any resource or anything, I can connect you with whoever and whenever. All right. So I write poetry, mostly poems about my personal experiences. You see, I've learned to take conversations and morph them into these poems. It was just the other day I was told to find my voice. But today, I'm trying to find the real meaning of my poetry. You see, I strayed away from it. It is my best friend, but also my worst enemy. It is a thing that haunts me in my sleep. It's the monkey on my back, and honestly, I really hate writing poems. It puts me in this mood most would call depression. You see, I wouldn't really call it depression, but it's something that gets me going and allows me to explain myself in ways I cannot do if I was asked to. You see, my poetry is my disguise. I hide behind metaphors and hope nobody reads between the lines. I add punctuation and pauses so I can reset my emotions. You see, I'm passionate about the words that I speak, but I rarely seek out the emotions that I seek. You see, I paint pictures with the flow of my words, but I pray the rain washes through my canvas so I can forget. You see, I started this poetry thing. I started it for me, but that's never really the case, because if my poetry didn't help me, I really hope it helps you. My name is Becky the Poet. That was one of my pieces. I got another one for you guys. So this poem, I'll give a little background. I was in a relationship, and they're listening to my poems, and I could tell they didn't really understand why I write poetry, right? They just thought it was just words. And then they asked me, what are you really trying to say in your poems? And I was like, oh, that's a good question. So this is that piece. So it was just the other day, I was told to find my voice. A voice within my poems, within each of my poems. It's always, what are you trying to say? You see, I never really thought about it. Backtracking to these thoughts in my head, these thoughts I can't hold on for too long, but I lock them away and throw away the key in hopes that key never shows up again. But you see, I don't really lock them away. I just put them to the side and say I'll deal with it another day. But whenever that day comes around, it turns to next time, and next time turns to what was I thinking and why. You see, my thoughts travel from one end of the world and back, changing directions, and I never really know where they're headed. So this voice I'm looking for, well, it seems hard to find. And I have yet to even know what it sounds like, because in general my voice is subtle, monotone, and the one time my feelings should get involved, they refuse to rise to the surface. And at that point, I'm stuck finding my voice, finding myself to find that voice. But that voice fades more and more as I write in silence than when I'm alone, but speak out loud when I'm staring at that woman in the mirror. But I refuse to stare at that woman in the mirror for too long, because she reminds me that I'm not okay. How did you guys feel about that one? Yeah? All right, I got one more for you guys. Answered your question? Oh, yeah? Exactly. That's why, I told you before, my poems are really conversations with people. You know, sometimes people ask me questions at that moment in time, and I can't answer that, right? So let me put in a poem for you so you can realize what's going on later. If you hear it, great. If you don't, oh, well, made a great poem, right? That's why they say don't date poets, because you'll turn it to a poem. You know what I'm saying? I got one more for you guys. I thought about killing you, and woke up and thought about killing myself, putting a Kanye on y'all. You see, I try to love you. I try to love you hard, but you fell through my fingertips like a sandcastle with no water, a building with no structure, no base for support. You see, I want to put it all together like a puzzle piece, but where's the missing piece? Searching, looking at the glass half full, but it's shattered before my eyes, leaving things half empty. Now what? Look what you done. Look what you done to me. You see, I wanted to save you, but how could I attempt to save a lost soul with no seed planted first? You see, I lost my way with you. Words came out of my mouth as the smoke was blowing into the wind, into a sea of darkness, but you pushed me away and wanted me to chase after you. So I ran after you after the wrong things, having me chase the idea that things were going to be fixed. How about this? How many human beings does it take to change a light bulb? Or even better, how many human beings does it take to change what doesn't need to be fixed? You see, love is a very, very, very strong word. So the next time someone asks me what love is, I'll tell them my love is more than just 4 letters. It starts with I and ends with myself. Thank you, thank you. So I am Becky the Poet. I do have a podcast called Unspoken Words. I talk about things that normally you don't want to talk about out loud, but I also get the insight behind business owners, entrepreneurs, and poets. I will be recording back again in July and then hosting an event in August to promote the recordings of my podcast. I do host poetry events. Like I said, I'm very active on Instagram. So one more time, it's Becky the Poet, and I appreciate y'all being here tonight. Do you have anything for me, Nancy?
Yes. Thank you so much, Becky. And you have a Food with Love, Words with Love, Buzz event coming up. The Vin Collective also has an event coming up called, in our Bottles, Bites, and Binge-Worthy series called Fragrance and Wine Pairing. And in that event, we're going to include Tanya Baker of Faith and Fire. So come out. You can check it out on www.thevincollective.com or in my Instagram @thevincollective.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my YouTube @Becky the Poet, and then follow me on Instagram, Becky the Poet, and the podcast, Unspoken Words Podcast. All right, you guys. Love y'all.